Before movies thrilled us and streaming platforms brought mysteries to our screens, there were the timeless words of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. With his brilliant pen, he gifted the world a character whose intellect and charm remain unmatched. Sherlock Holmes, the legendary detective who continues to inspire generations. Today's tale, The Adventure of the Crooked Man, is one of Holmes's most emotionally complex cases. First published in 1893 as part of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, it takes us beyond just crime and deduction into the hidden corners of love, betrayal, and long-buried secrets. If you're new here or haven't yet explored the other stories, check out our playlist of full Sherlock Holmes audio adventures, each one voiced and produced to bring Victorian London alive. And if these mysteries are keeping you hooked, we'd love your support. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue narrating these unforgettable classics for you. Now, let's follow Holmes and Watson to a quiet military town where a respected colonel has died under strange circumstances, and only a deformed stranger from the past holds the key to the truth. This is The Adventure of the Crooked Man. One summer night, just a few months after my marriage, I was seated beside my own hearth, smoking a final pipe and nodding over a novel. It had been an exhausting day's work. My wife had already gone upstairs, and the sound of the hall door being locked earlier had told me the servants had also retired. I had just risen from my chair and was knocking out the ashes from my pipe when suddenly the doorbell rang loudly. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:45. Surely no visitor would call at such a late hour. A patient, no doubt, and possibly a case requiring me to stay up all night. With a resigned expression, I stepped into the hallway and opened the front door. To my astonishment, there stood Sherlock Holmes.
"Oh, Watson, I hoped I wouldn't be too late to catch you."
"My dear fellow, please come in."
"You look surprised, and rightly so. Perhaps even a little relieved, I'd say. You're still smoking the Arcadia mixture from your bachelor days. That ash on your coat gives it away. It's also obvious that you used to wear a uniform. You'll never pass for a full-time civilian while you keep carrying your handkerchief in your sleeve like that. Can you put me up for the night?"
"With pleasure."
"You once told me you had bachelor quarters for one, and it's clear there's no gentleman visiting right now. Your hat stand makes that obvious."
"I'd be delighted if you stayed."
"Thanks. I'll hang my hat there then. Sorry to see you've had a British workman in the house. They're always a bad sign. Not the drains, I hope?"
"No, the gas."
"Ah, he left 2 boot marks on your linoleum, right where the light catches." "No, thank you. I already had supper at Waterloo, but I'll gladly share a pipe with you."
I handed him my pouch, and he sat down across from me. We smoked in silence for a while. I knew Holmes wouldn't have come at such an hour unless it was something truly important, so I waited patiently for him to bring it up.
"I can see you've been professionally quite busy lately,"
he said, glancing at me with that sharp gaze of his. "Yes, it's been a hectic day. It might sound silly to you, but I honestly don't know how you figured that out."
"I have the advantage of knowing your habits, my dear Watson. When your patient rounds are short, you walk. When they're long, you take a hansom. Your boots are worn, but hardly dirty. So clearly, your rounds are long enough these days to justify hiring a hansom."
"Excellent."
"Elementary. This is one of those instances where a reasoner can create an effect that appears extraordinary to others, only because they missed a tiny yet crucial point upon which the deduction depends. The same applies, my dear fellow, to some of your little case sketches. Their impact is entirely superficial, since you keep back key details from your readers that are essential to understanding the solution. Right now, I'm in the same position as those readers. I'm holding several threads of one of the most perplexing cases I've ever faced. Yet I still lack the 1 or 2 details needed to complete my theory. But I'll get them, Watson. I will."
His eyes lit up, and a faint flush colored his pale cheeks, but only for a moment. When I looked again, his expression had returned to that stoic calm, that Red Indian composure, which made so many mistake him for a machine rather than a man.
"This case presents features of interest, exceptional interest, I might say. I've already made some headway, and I believe I'm close to my solution. If you could accompany me on the final step, your help might prove invaluable.
I'd be delighted.
Could you go to Aldershot tomorrow?
I'm sure Jackson would cover my practice.
Excellent. I want to catch the 11:10 from Waterloo.
That should give me enough time.
Then, if you're not too tired, I'll give you an outline of what's happened so far and what still remains to be done.
I was sleepy before you arrived. I'm wide awake now.
I'll keep it as brief as possible without omitting anything vital. It's possible you've already heard something about the case. It concerns the alleged murder of Colonel Barclay of the Royal Mallows in Aldershot.
I haven't heard a word.
It hasn't made national news yet, only some local attention. The events are just 2 days old. Here's a quick summary. The Royal Mallows, as you know, is one of the most distinguished Irish regiments in the British Army. It earned fame in the Crimea and during the Indian Mutiny, and has proven its valor on every battlefield since. Until Monday night, it was led by Colonel James Barclay, a brave veteran who began his career as a private, earned his commission through courage during the mutiny, and rose to command the very regiment where he once served as a foot soldier. Colonel Barclay married while still a sergeant. His wife, Nancy Devoy, was the daughter of a former color sergeant in the same regiment. Naturally, their transition into officer life brought a few social challenges, as you might expect, but they adapted well. Mrs. Barclay, I'm told, has always been beloved among the regimental ladies, just as her husband was respected by his fellow officers. I should add, she was a striking beauty in her youth, and even now, over 30 years into their marriage, she still carries herself with a regal, commanding presence. Colonel Barclay's family life appears to have been consistently happy. Major Murphy, my primary source, assures me he never witnessed or heard of any quarrels between the colonel and his wife. In fact, he believes Barclay's devotion to his wife exceeded hers toward him. The colonel was visibly uneasy even if he spent a single day away from her. She, though faithful and affectionate, wasn't as openly demonstrative in return. Still, the regiment considered them the ideal middle-aged couple. Nothing in their relationship gave even a hint of the tragedy that would unfold. That said, Colonel Barclay himself seemed to have a few unusual traits. In his typical mood, he was a cheerful, spirited old soldier, but there were times when he could show signs of harshness and even vindictiveness. Fortunately, this side of him never seemed to surface in his interactions with his wife. Another thing noted by Major Murphy and 3 out of 5 officers I spoke to was his occasional bouts of deep depression. The Major described it as though some invisible hand would wipe the smile from his face right in the middle of jokes and laughter at the mess table. During these spells, which could last for days, he would withdraw completely into himself. Along with that, he had a touch of superstition, most notably, a fear of being alone, especially after dark. This childish trait, in a man otherwise so bold and masculine, often sparked comment and speculation. The 1st Battalion of the Royal Mallows, originally the 117th, had been stationed at Aldershot for some years. The married officers lived outside the barracks, and the colonel had resided during all that time at a villa called Lachine, located about half a mile from the North Camp. The house sits within its own grounds, although the western wall is just 30 yards from the main road. The staff consisted of a coachman and 2 maids. Other than them and the Barclays themselves, who had no children, there were no permanent residents or regular visitors at Lachine. Now, let's focus on what happened at Lachine between 9 and 10 o'clock on the evening of last Monday. Mrs. Barclay was a practicing Roman Catholic and had taken an active interest in a charitable group called the Guild of St. George. This was affiliated with the Watt Street Chapel and worked to distribute used clothing to the poor. A meeting of the guild had been scheduled for 8 that evening. Mrs. Barclay rushed through her dinner so she wouldn't be late. As she left, the coachman overheard her saying something casual to the colonel and assuring him she wouldn't be long. Then she went next door to fetch Miss Morrison, a young woman who lived in the adjoining villa. The 2 ladies attended the meeting, which lasted about 40 minutes. At around 9:15, Mrs. Barclay returned home, having dropped Miss Morrison off at her door on the way. There's a room at Lachine used as the morning room. It faces the road and has large glass folding doors that open onto the lawn. The lawn stretches about 30 yards and is separated from the public road by a low wall topped with iron railings. It was into this room that Mrs. Barclay went after she returned home. The blinds were still up, as the room wasn't typically used in the evening. She lit the lamp herself and rang for tea, quite unusual for her. Jane Stewart, the housemaid, was asked to bring it. The colonel had been in the dining room, but hearing that his wife was back, he crossed the hallway and joined her in the morning room. The coachman saw him enter. He was never seen alive again. 10 minutes later, the tea was brought. As the maid approached the room, she heard her master and mistress in the midst of a violent quarrel. She knocked, but got no answer. She turned the handle, only to find the door locked from the inside. Alarmed, she ran to the kitchen and returned with the cook. The coachman joined them as they stood in the hall listening. The argument was still ongoing. All three agreed. They heard only two voices, Colonel Barclay and his wife. Barclay's voice was low and abrupt, the words unintelligible. But the lady's voice was sharp, furious, and clearly heard. She cried out, "You coward," again and again. "What can be done now? What can be done now? Give me back my life. I will never breathe the same air with you again. You coward! You coward!" These were the fragments they caught, until suddenly there was a dreadful cry in a man's voice, followed by a crash, and then a piercing scream from the woman. Convinced something terrible had happened, the coachman tried to break down the door, while more screams echoed from inside. But he couldn't get it open, and the two maids were too terrified to help. Then a thought struck him. He ran out through the front door and around to the lawn, where the French windows opened into the room. One of the windows was open, as it often was on summer nights, so he entered without difficulty. Inside, Mrs. Barclay had stopped screaming. She lay unconscious on the couch, and the colonel, the poor man, lay dead, his feet draped over one side of the armchair, his head on the floor near the fender, and blood pooled beneath him. A truly gruesome sight. Naturally, the coachman's first instinct was to unlock the door. But then came a strange twist. The key was missing. It wasn't inside the door. He searched the room, but found nothing. So he went back out through the window and brought help. A police officer and a medical man. The lady, naturally the first suspect, was still unconscious and taken to her room. The colonel's body was laid on the sofa, and then a thorough investigation of the scene began. The injury that the unfortunate veteran had suffered was a jagged wound about 2 inches long at the back of his head, clearly the result of a violent strike from a blunt object, and it wasn't difficult to identify the likely weapon. Lying near the body was a strange wooden club, hard and carved, with a handle made of bone. Colonel Barclay owned a large collection of weapons, gathered during his military campaigns in various parts of the world. The police believed this club may have been part of that collection. The servants claimed they had never seen it before, but considering the number of unusual items in the house, it could have gone unnoticed. The police found nothing else of importance in the room, except for one puzzling detail. The key to the locked door was missing. It wasn't on Mrs. Barclay, it wasn't on the colonel, and it wasn't anywhere else in the room. Eventually, a locksmith from Aldershot had to be called in to force the door open. That's how things stood, Watson, when I arrived in Aldershot on Tuesday morning at Major Murphy's request to assist the police. I'm sure you'll agree the case was already intriguing, but my observations quickly revealed it to be far more unusual than it first appeared. Before I examined the crime scene, I interviewed the household staff. Unfortunately, I learned nothing new beyond the facts I've already shared, but one detail did emerge during a second round of questioning. Jane Stewart, the housemaid, remembered something else. You'll recall she was the first to hear the argument, and initially went alone to check. She said that when she first reached the door, the voices of Colonel and Mrs. Barclay were too low to make out clearly. She judged that they were quarreling, not by words, but by their tone. However, after I pressed her, she remembered hearing Mrs. Barclay say the word David twice. Now that's significant, Watson. Very significant. The Colonel's name as you know, was James. There was another element in this case that left a lasting impression on both the servants and the police. The expression on Colonel Barclay's face. According to all accounts, it was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The fear and horror etched into his features were so awful that more than one person fainted at the sight. It was clear. He saw his death coming, and it terrified him. That detail does support the police theory, of course. If the colonel had seen his wife about to strike him, and the fact that the wound was on the back of his head doesn't entirely refute that idea, he might have turned just before the blow. As for Mrs. Barclay, no answers could be gathered from her. She still is, completely unconscious and suffering from what the doctors describe as acute brain fever. She's temporarily insane. From the police, I learned that Miss Morrison, you remember, the young lady who accompanied Mrs. Barclay that evening, denied any knowledge of what might have caused a sudden change in Mrs. Barclay's mood when she returned home. After collecting all these facts, Watson, I sat down and smoked several pipes, trying to sift the vital clues from the incidental. One point stood out more than any other: the strange disappearance of the door key. A thorough search of the room had failed to produce it, so it must have been removed. Now, it was clear neither Colonel Barclay nor his wife could have taken it after the incident. That was beyond dispute. Therefore, a third party had entered the room, and that third person could have come only through the window. I decided a careful examination of both the room and the lawn might reveal some trace of this mystery guest. You know my methods, Watson. I used every one of them, and in the end, I did find traces, but they weren't at all what I expected. There had been a man in the room. He had approached from the road, crossed the lawn, and entered through the window. I was able to locate 5 clear impressions of his feet, one in the road, right where he scaled the low wall, 2 across the lawn, and 2 faint ones on the stained floorboards inside the window. He must have moved quickly. His toe marks were deeper than his heels. But it wasn't the man that surprised me, Watson. It was his companion.
His companion? Holmes pulled a large sheet of tissue paper from his coat pocket and carefully unfolded it on his knee.
What do you make of that?
The sheet was covered with the tracings of small animal footprints, 5 pads on each, long claws, and roughly the size of a dessert spoon. I said, "It's a dog."
Have you ever heard of a dog running up a curtain? I found definite traces showing this creature had done just that.
A monkey, then?
But it's not the footprint of a monkey.
Then what is it?
Neither dog, nor cat, nor monkey, nor any familiar creature. I've reconstructed its likely form from the impressions. Here, see these 4 prints? The creature stood still here. From front paw to back paw, it's about 15 inches. Add the neck and head, and the whole thing is probably close to 2 feet long, or more if it had a tail. Now look at this, stride length during movement, only about 3 inches. That tells us it has a long body with very short legs. No hairs left behind, unfortunately, but the anatomy is clear enough. It can climb curtains. It eats meat.
How can you tell that?
Because it ran up the curtain to reach a canary's cage that was hanging in the window. Its goal was clearly the bird.
Then what sort of beast is it?
If I could name it, I might be closer to solving the case. Most likely, it belongs to the weasel or stoat family, but it's larger than any I've ever seen.
And what connection does this animal have to the crime?
That part is still unclear, but we have learned a great deal. We know someone stood in the road watching the Barclays argue. The blinds were up, the room was lit. He ran across the lawn, entered the house, and was accompanied by that strange animal. Now, it's possible he struck the colonel, or just as likely, the colonel fell backward in sheer fright at the sight of him, and hit his head fatally against the fender. And the key, don't forget, the intruder took it with him when he fled.
Your discoveries seem to have made the case even more obscure than before.
Quite so. They clearly show that the matter runs far deeper than we first imagined. I decided I needed to approach the case from a new angle. But truly, Watson, I'm keeping you up. Perhaps I should save the rest for our journey to Aldershot tomorrow.
Thank you, but you've come too far to stop now.
Very well. It's quite certain that when Mrs. Barclay left the house at 7:30, she was on perfectly good terms with her husband. As I mentioned before, she was not overly affectionate, but the coachman heard them chatting in a pleasant, friendly way. Now, consider this. When she returned, she immediately went to the morning room, a place where she was least likely to see the colonel. She called for tea, something she never usually did, and when he entered, she broke into a fierce argument with him. So something happened between 7:30 and 9 o'clock that radically changed her feelings. But Miss Morrison had been with her the entire time, so despite her denial, it's certain she knows something. My first guess was perhaps there had been something inappropriate between Miss Morrison and the colonel, which the girl confessed to Mrs. Barclay. That could explain the fury, and also why the girl denied it. It even fit some of the overheard words. But then there was the reference to David, the colonel's deep affection for his wife, and the intrusion of that unknown man. Altogether, it didn't quite fit. I began to suspect Miss Morrison wasn't involved with the colonel, but she definitely held the key to what turned Mrs. Barclay's feelings to hatred. So I went to see her. I explained that I was certain she knew more than she had revealed, and that if the truth didn't come out, her friend could face a capital charge. She's a delicate, ethereal young woman, fair hair, timid eyes, but not lacking in common sense. She sat in silence for a while. Then, with sudden resolution, she told me everything. I'll summarize her remarkable statement. When I spoke to Miss Morrison and explained the seriousness of the situation, she finally opened up. It turns out that on Monday evening, she and Mrs. Barclay were returning from a meeting at the What Street mission. As they passed through a quiet street called Hudson Street, poorly lit with just a single lamp, they encountered a strange man approaching them. This man appeared deformed. His back was bent, his head hung low, and he carried what looked like a box slung across his shoulder. As he stepped into the circle of lamplight, he suddenly recognized Mrs. Barclay and reacted with a cry that shocked both women. Mrs. Barclay, in turn, was visibly shaken, so much so that she nearly collapsed and had to be supported by the man himself. Miss Morrison, alarmed by the encounter, was about to call for help. But surprisingly, Mrs. Barclay stopped her and calmly engaged the man in conversation. It was clear to Miss Morrison that they knew each other from the past, possibly from many years ago. The man's appearance was deeply unsettling, aged, with gray-streaked hair, a dark, shriveled face, and a wild, almost haunted expression. She described him as looking like someone who had endured great suffering. Mrs. Barclay asked Miss Morrison to walk ahead, wanting a private word with the stranger. Miss Morrison complied. After a few minutes, Mrs. Barclay returned, her eyes filled with rage. When Miss Morrison looked back, the crippled man was standing beneath the lamppost, violently shaking his fists at the sky, clearly overcome with anger. Mrs. Barclay said nothing more until they reached home. Then, she simply asked Miss Morrison to keep everything secret, dismissing the man as just an unfortunate acquaintance who had fallen on hard times. Miss Morrison agreed, not realizing how serious the matter would become later that night. When I assured her that the truth could save Mrs. Barclay from great danger, she felt morally free to share the story. It was clear to me that this encounter, this sudden reappearance of a man from her past, was the turning point that transformed her mood and led to the violent quarrel we now know occurred later that evening. There was her statement, Watson, and to me, as you can imagine, it was like a light on a dark night. Everything which had been disconnected before began at once to assume its true place, and I had a shadowy presentiment of the whole sequence of events. My next step, obviously, was to find the man who had produced such a remarkable impression upon Mrs. Barclay. If he were still in Aldershot, it should not be a very difficult matter. There are not such a very great number of civilians, and a deformed man was sure to have attracted attention. I spent a day in the search, and by evening, this very evening, Watson, I had run him down. The man's name is Henry Wood, and he lives in lodgings in this same street in which the ladies met him. He has only been 5 days in the place. In the character of a registration agent, I had a most interesting gossip with his landlady. The man is by trade a conjurer and performer, going round the canteens after nightfall and giving a little entertainment at each. He carries some creature about with him in that box, about which the landlady seemed to be in considerable trepidation, for she had never seen an animal like it. He uses it in some of his tricks, according to her account. So much the woman was able to tell me, and also that it was a wonder the man lived, seeing how twisted he was, and that he spoke in a strange tongue sometimes, and that for the last 2 nights she had heard him groaning and weeping in his bedroom. He was all right, as far as money went, but in his deposit he had given her what looked like a bad florin. She showed it to me, Watson, and it was an Indian rupee. So now, my dear fellow, you see exactly how we stand and why it is I want you. It is perfectly plain that after the ladies parted from this man, he followed them at a distance, that he saw the quarrel between husband and wife through the window, that he rushed in, and that the creature which he carried in his box got loose. That is all very certain, but he is the only person in this world who can tell us exactly what happened in that room.
And you're going to question him?
Absolutely, but with a witness present.
And I'm the witness?
If you'll do me the honor. If he's willing to explain, all the better. If not, we'll have no choice but to apply for a warrant.
But how can you be sure he'll still be there when we get back?
I took some precautions. One of my Baker Street boys is keeping watch. He'll stick to him like glue. No matter where he goes, the boy will follow. We'll find him in Hudson Street tomorrow, Watson. And now, I'd be the criminal if I kept you out of bed any longer.
By midday the next day, we were back at the scene of the tragedy. Guided by Holmes, we made our way straight to Hudson Street. Despite his ability to hide emotions, I could sense his restrained excitement, while I myself felt that familiar thrill, a mix of sport and intellect, that I always experienced during our investigations.
This is the street,
said he, as we turned into a short thoroughfare lined with plain 2-storied brick houses.
Ah, here is Simpson to report.
A scruffy boy ran up to us and said to Holmes, "He's an all right, Mr. Holmes."
Good, Simpson,
said Holmes, patting him on the head.
Come along, Watson. This is the house.
He sent in his card with a message that he had come on important business, and a moment later we were face to face with the man who we had come to see. In spite of the warm weather, he was crouching over a fire, and the little room was like an oven. The man sat all twisted and huddled in his chair in a way which gave an indescribable impression of deformity. But the face which he turned towards us, though worn and swarthy, must at some time have been remarkable for its beauty. He looked suspiciously at us now out of yellow-shot, bilious eyes, and, without speaking or rising, he waved towards 2 chairs.
Mr. Henry Wood, late of India, I believe. I've come over this little matter of Colonel Barclay's death.
What should I know about that?
That's what I want to ascertain. You know, I suppose, that unless the matter is cleared up, Mrs. Barclay, who is an old friend of yours, will in all probability be tried for murder.
The man gave a violent start.
I don't know who you are, nor how you come to know what you do know. But will you swear that this is true that you tell me?
Why? They're only waiting for her to come to her senses to arrest her.
My God, are you in the police yourself?
No.
What business is it of yours, then?
It's every man's business to see justice done.
You can take my word that she is innocent.
Then you are guilty.
No, I am not.
Who killed Colonel James Barclay, then?
It was just Providence that killed him. But mind you this, that if I had knocked his brains out, as it was in my heart to do, he would have had no more than his due from my hands. If his own guilty conscience had not struck him down, it is likely enough that I might have had his blood upon my soul. You want me to tell the story? Well, I don't know why I shouldn't, for there's no cause for me to be ashamed of it. It was in this way, sir. You see me now with my back like a camel and my ribs all awry, but there was a time when Corporal Henry was the smartest man in the 117th foot. We were in India then, in cantonments, at a place we'll call Bertie. Barclay, who died the other day, was sergeant in the same company as myself, and the belle of the regiment, I, and the finest girl that ever had the breath of life between her lips was Nancy Devoy, the daughter of the color sergeant. There were 2 men that loved her, and one that she loved, And you'll smile when you look at this poor thing huddled before the fire and hear me say that it was from my good looks that she loved me. Well, though I had her heart, her father was set upon her marrying Barclay. I was a harum-scarum, reckless lad, and he had an education and was already marked for the sword belt. But the girl held true to me, and it seemed that I would have had her when the mutiny broke out and all hell was loose in the country. We were shut up in Bertie, the regiment of us with half a battery of artillery, a company of Sikhs, and a lot of civilians and women folk. There were 10,000 rebels round us, and they were as keen as a set of terriers round a rat cage. About the second week of it, our water gave out, and it was a question whether we could communicate with General Neal's column, which was moving up country. It was our only chance, for we could not hope to fight our way out with all the women and children. So I volunteered to go out and to warn General Neal of our danger. My offer was accepted, and I talked it over with Sergeant Barclay, who was supposed to know the ground better than any other man, and who drew up a route by which I might get through the rebel lines. At 10 o'clock the same night, I started off upon my journey. There were 1,000 lives to save, but it was of only one that I was thinking when I dropped over the wall that night. My way ran down a dried-up watercourse, which we hoped would screen me from the enemy's sentries. But as I crept round the corner of it, I walked right into 6 of them, who were crouching down in the dark waiting for me. In an instant, I was stunned with a blow and bound hand and foot. But the real blow was to my heart and not to my head, for as I came to and listened to as much as I could understand their talk, I heard enough to tell me that my comrade, the very man who had arranged the way that I was to take, had betrayed me by means of a native servant into the hands of the enemy. Well, there's no need for me to dwell on that part of it. You know now what James Barclay was capable of. Bertie was relieved by Neal next day, but the rebels took me away with them in their retreat. And it was many a long year before ever I saw a white face again. I was tortured and tried to get away, and was captured and tortured again. You can see for yourselves the state in which I was left. Some of them that fled into Nepal took me with them, and then afterwards I was up past Darjeeling. The hill folk up there murdered the rebels who had me, and I became their slave for a time until I escaped. But instead of going south, I had to go north, until I found myself among the Afghans. There I wandered about for many a year, and at last came back to Punjab, where I lived mostly among the natives and picked up a living by the conjuring tricks that I learned. What use was it for me, a wretched cripple, to go back to England or to make myself known to my old comrades? Even my wish for revenge would not make me do that. I had rather that Nancy and my old pals should think of Harry Wood as having died with a straight back than see him living and crawling with a stick like a chimpanzee. They never doubted that I was dead, and I meant that they never should. I heard that Barclay had married Nancy, and that he was rising rapidly in the regiment, but even that did not make me speak. But when one gets old, one has a longing for home. For years, I've been dreaming of the bright green fields and the hedges of England. At last, I determined to see them before I died. I saved enough to bring me across, and then I came here where the soldiers are, for I know their ways and how to amuse them, and so earn enough to keep me.
Your narrative is most interesting. I have already heard of your meeting with Mrs. Barclay and your mutual recognition. You then, as I understand, followed her home and saw through the window an altercation between her husband and her, in which she doubtless cast his conduct to you in his teeth. Your own feelings overcame you, and you ran across the lawn and broke in upon them.
I did, sir, and at the sight of me he looked as I have never seen a man look before, and over he went with his head on the fender. But he was dead before he fell. I read death on his face as plain as I can read that text over fire. The bare sight of me was like a bullet through his guilty heart.
And then?
Then Nancy fainted, and I caught up the key of the door from her hand, intending to unlock it and get help. But as I was doing it, it seemed to me better to leave it alone and get away, for the thing might look black against me, and anyway my secret would be out if I were taken. In my haste, I thrust the key into my pocket and dropped my stick while I was chasing Teddy, who had run up the curtain. When I got him into his box, from which he had slipped, I was off as fast as I could run.
Who's Teddy?
The man leaned over and pulled up the front of a kind of hutch in the corner. In an instant out, there slipped a beautiful reddish-brown creature, thin and lithe, with the legs of a stoat, a long, thin nose, and a pair of the finest red eyes that ever I saw on an animal's head. I cried, "It's a mongoose."
Well, some call them that, and some call them ichneumon. Snake catcher is what I call them. And Teddy is amazing quick on cobras. I have one here without the fangs, and Teddy catches it every night to please the folk in canteen. Any other points, sir?
Well, we may have to apply to you again if Mrs. Barclay should prove to be in serious trouble.
In that case, of course, I'd come forward.
But if not, there's no object in raking up this scandal against a dead man, foully as he has acted. You have at least the satisfaction of knowing that for 30 years of his life, his conscience bitterly reproached him for this wicked deed. Ah, there goes Major Murphy on the other side of the street. Goodbye, Wood. I want to learn if anything has happened since yesterday.
We were in time to overtake the Major before he reached the corner.
Holmes, I suppose you have heard that all this fuss has come to nothing?
What then?
The inquest is just over. The medical evidence showed conclusively that death was due to apoplexy. You see, it was quite a simple case after all.
Oh, remarkably superficial. Come, Watson. I don't think we shall be wanted in Aldershot anymore.
As we walked down to the station, I said, "There's one thing. If the husband's name was James and the other was Henry, what was this talk about, David?"
That one word, my dear Watson, should have told me the whole story had I been the ideal reasoner, which you are so fond of depicting. It was evidently a term of reproach.
Of reproach?
Yes, David strayed a little occasionally, you know, and on one occasion in the same direction as Sergeant James Barclay. You remember the small affair of Uriah and Bathsheba. My biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty, I fear, but you will find a story in the 1st or 2nd of Samuel.